afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for waiting. Also on behalf of BA. When we didn't leave from Budapest for 40 minutes, I thought it must be because we are out of the crisis and the European airspace is so busy. Then when we arrived to Heathrow and we had to wait 25 minutes for the stairs being pulled to the plane, I thought maybe the crisis has hit BAA so badly that they don't have enough stairs. Anything can go. But to jump into this quickly, you know, when I was visiting a university in Budapest in the mid-80s, in 1986, when I got started, it was called the Karl Marx University of Economics. And the introductory subject to economics was political economy. And when I finished my studies in 1991, the university, the very same university, was already called Budapest University of Economics, and we were studying economic policy. And I thought that for the rest of my life, I will always focus on economic policy and I can forget about political economy. But as this crisis has hit our countries, we had to realize, and this is probably the motto of my speech today, that political economy is back with a vengeance. Not probably on the Marxist way as we have started to learn in 1986, but still, without understanding the relationship between politics and economics, it is very difficult to understand and even more difficult to anticipate what is ahead of us in the coming years. So to get started, let me give you what I believe are the 5 key trends from my experience on which those European leaders who are active today are focusing when they try to plan the future and try to anticipate their motions. I believe that in the post-crisis environment there are 5 key trends that are shaping our future, which are driving political economy. The number 1 is that growth in the developed world is going to be significantly lower looking ahead for the next decade than it used to be in the previous 2 decades. What it means in practice, I always try to translate these generic trends into practice of political economy. What it means, there will be a long deleveraging, a lot higher level of unemployment, and that means that for the politicians, it means there is less money to distribute between social groups. The second key trend is, as a result of this crisis, is the threat of reverse mobility in our societies. That's a major threat. Think back on the 1930s. As a result of this crisis, those tens of millions in Europe and hundreds of millions in the world who have climbed from being poor to being lower middle class with the help of cheap credit and new jobs are now facing the loss of this status of lower middle class and facing the danger of slipping back to poverty. Because these are the 2 things that are gone as a result of this crisis: new jobs and cheap loans, or easy loans. Now, what this means in practice is a significantly increased risk of social instability. There was an English historian who said 100 years ago that revolutions are not made by those who are poor, but by those who get disappointed. And the biggest risk in our society that the number of people who are getting disappointed is growing very quickly, like in the 1930s they did. And as a result of slower growth, which was my first point on global trends, there is less money available, and as the risk of social slip back is growing, more money would be needed to stabilize the bottom of the middle classes. The third key trend that is on the mind of European politicians is the growing amount of potential intergenerational conflicts. This crisis has not changed the key global trends that were already valid before the crisis, but it has significantly accelerated the pace of change and the coming of those problems which we were facing anyway. One of the most notable ones is the demographic problems of Europe. What this means is that for the problem of an aging society and consequential demographic problems, there are only three solutions. Either you increase retirement age, you decrease pensions, or you increase significantly migration. There is a calculation that if Europe wants to keep its current active to inactive ratio, including the educational distribution of jobs, Europe should increase its migration compared to today's 4 to 5-fold in the coming decades. Now think about the consequences, especially about the debate that is ongoing in the UK today about migration. The fourth key dangerous trend that European leaders have to bear in mind when they decide about the future of the continent is that in each crisis, isms are strengthening. First, it's protectionism, which is the national reaction to a crisis. Nations turn inward. Then protectionism is the anteroom of nationalism, and then other forms of populism. Sometimes communism, sometimes fascism, as in the 1930s, or other forms of populism that you can experience, less harmful forms of populism like the ones that you can experience after the Italian elections. But these isms, which start to flourish in crisis, are always about how to redistribute the existing assets in a society as opposed to share into the growth of a society, how to take money away from someone and give it to another group. So it's a very dangerous process, especially on those societies in Europe where the original accumulation of democratic capital, to use a Marxist term, has not gone far enough, like it was in Germany in the 1930s, like it is in certain Central and Eastern European countries today. And the fifth key trend that European leaders have to bear in mind is the impact of global rebalancing has significantly been accelerated. The loss of global clout of the developed world, and most notably Europe, has accelerated a lot. That means our ability to spend from international aid, where Europe used to be the largest donor, probably the most inefficient from its own foreign policy point of view, but the largest donor in the world, to military spending, where Europe has the largest army, second largest army in the world by number of people, but probably the most inefficient army in this respect. So the global influence of the European continent, as we call it, or the European Union, unless we are able to turn around our ratio of spending on these issues, will definitely diminish, and that will reduce our ability to represent our interest in the face of new emerging powers. So these are the five key trends that European leaders have to bear in mind when they face the future. Most of these trends, except the demographic one, are also true for the United States, but each of them are more true for Europe than the United States or other parts of the developed world. Now, if you try to put these trends in context, then we should look at the raison d'être, the reason to exist for the European Union. And this reason to exist has changed a lot during the last 60 years. When Europe was established, it was primarily established to avoid war, to avoid another war. One historian said that in the world, all federations have been created to fight an external enemy, except in the European Union, where the European Federation was created against itself, against its bad habit to go to war in every 20, 30 years. Now, this project was so successful that very quickly Europe turned to establish the welfare state, a very special model in the world, which doesn't exist anywhere else. It's very special. Whether it can be successful long term is a big question mark at the moment, but it was established and it has operated for a couple of decades. Now, this welfare state is unique. I have been talking to a fund manager a year ago in the US, and he told me, if you go to the US, everything is about more profit. If you go to Asia, everything is about more jobs. If you go to Europe, everything is about more welfare. Well, it's an interesting and probably exaggerating idea, but definitely there is something to it, and that is something we need to face. However, the welfare state period was very successful for a couple of decades, but in the early 1990s, Europe had to face two new challenges. One was very successfully solved. This was Europe becoming unipolar after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then Europe has run its most successful foreign policy to date, the European expansion. In 15 years, it has enlarged Europe, practically following the advice of Catherine the Great, Tsarin of Russia, who said a couple of hundred years ago that I cannot protect my borders but to expand them. And that's what Europe has done by pushing out its eastern borders very far closer into the sphere of the former Soviet Union. This was very successful and very fast. And I'll come back to this in the second part of my lecture. But Europe has also faced another challenge in the early 90s, which was the challenge of globalization. At the beginning, the European Union was a great benefactor of this. Cheaper prices, lower inflation, higher growth were all helping the European continent to strengthen its position, but also not to face certain important structural reform needs that were around. But as the globalization, what it has meant is that cheap jobs with low skills and low value added have all migrated to other parts of the world and left the low skilled people here, but the jobs have gone to China, India, Brazil, and elsewhere gradually. This loss of sustainable jobs has been hidden by a significant flow of cheap and easy credit and the subsequent development of real estate development and other forms of non-sustainable development in the continent. As if you look into Spain or Ireland or other countries who have benefited from this, but even the UK to a degree. But gradually, the threshold of low value added jobs has started, the threshold of low value added has started to climb up and up. And more jobs were lost. And subsequent investment and technology has also left the continent and went into other parts of the world. And Europe has been delayed, except for the northern part, in finding an answer to this problem. So in the early 2000s, Europe has started to face the loss of competitiveness. This was the time when, in the mid-early 2000s, President Barroso have said, if things continue this way, the United States is going to be the innovation center of the world. China is going to be the manufacturing center of the world. India is going to be the service center of the world. And Europe is going to be the museum of the world. So Europe has developed the so-called Lisbon programs, which had high ambitions and extremely low performance. I just give you one example of this limited success of this program. If you take 2005 as a starting base for the major regions in the world, and take each region's GDP 100 in 2005, then in 2010, Europe's GDP was 104 compared to 2005, which at least we were growing despite the crisis. The US was 105. So although our ambition was to overtake them, like that of Khrushchev in the 1960s. But at least we only got left behind by 1 percentage point in growth terms in 5 years. So it's not that bad. But during the same period of time, India has gone from 100 to 107. Sorry, Brazil has gone from 100 to 107. India has gone from 100 to 145. And China has gone to 167 in the same 5 years. So while we were growing, others were catching up much faster as we. So that sort of growth problem was there well before the crisis. And given that after the crisis we are going to face a strong, long deleveraging, a long, slow growth period, this change of balance is accelerating. So before the crisis, Europe had a major structural problem in competitiveness. And except for Germany and maybe a few countries in the north, like Sweden and Finland, most of the countries did not address this. But as a result of the crisis, we are now in the period of the crisis coming out of crisis management, because we not only have the structural problems, but most European countries, those who could afford it, have amassed huge amounts of debt and deficit, mountains of debt and deficit. So today, European countries face two problems at the same time. They need to introduce structural reforms, and they need to run austerity programs. Pretty much what you experience in the UK and most of the European countries. Now, I don't know how many economists are there in the room. Economists? A few, okay. Austerity and structural reform are two very fashionable phrases for economists. But what does it mean for politicians? Austerity means that you have to ask money back from your voters. And structural reform means you have to ask your voters to fundamentally change the way they live. These are the two things voters hate most in their life. That is why Europe is now facing a major and long political crisis at the national level, the nation-state level. A major political instability. Since the onset of this crisis, Europe has lost, since 2009, Europe has lost around 18 or 19 governments by now. It's difficult to keep track of that, out of the 27. In some countries, several ones, like in Greece or Italy. And what we can expect for the next 5 years also is a very unstable political environment in Europe as a result of this difficult period. You will find strange new parties emerging from nowhere. Even in the UK, you can experience that these days. You will find strange coalitions being formed in different countries. We expect it in Italy now, most recently. You can expect early elections and governments falling before their time is due, as it happened on many occasions already, and it will happen in the coming years. You will expect in the UK, unknown phenomenon of short-lived technocratic governments taking over from politicians. And in general, these years are exaggerating the otherwise normal wrestling between technocracy and populism, or popular democracy. I read an analysis from a major European analyst who said technocracy is populism without policy. Oh, sorry, politics without policy. The technocracy is policy without politics, and populism is politics without policy. I got it right for the third time. Yes. Please remember the third version. So, populism and technocracy are the two extremes which cannot survive for long, because it can ruin a country. But if you think of what is happening today in most of the European countries, you experience either of those. And what is slowing down Europe today is that major countries are facing existential decisions. France is facing a decision whether it's a country that belongs to the north or the south of Europe. And it's a real existential decision for France. Italy has to make this decision within itself, whether it's the south or the north of Italy that rules the country. The UK has to decide whether it's the most western Atlantic member of the European Union or the closest western neighbor of the European Union. Germany is facing an election where the German society, it seems from the polls, wants a green-red coalition led by Angela Merkel, which is not an easy solution. And we could go on and on analyzing those existential dilemmas for most of the European countries. So, can you call it a crisis of democracy in Europe? I'm not sure. In certain countries where the original accumulation of democratic capital is not strong enough, where the political culture, democratic political culture is not strong enough, it can become a crisis of democracy. But otherwise, what is happening is probably not a crisis, but a feature of democracy. A feature of how democracy is operating in a crisis situation. Now, so at the nation level, at the national level, what you experience is a political crisis. But there is another crisis at the all-European level. The global crisis has highlighted that what we have here is a crisis of the European integration as well. Because this integration has been a half-hearted, half-considered, half-explained, and half-finished integration. This was genetically coded into the structure of the European Union when it was established. The founding fathers realized that Europe cannot go with one major leap into a United States of Europe, and probably that's not what they wanted anyway. But what they saw that Europe will develop from crisis to crisis, like in the great book of Isaac Asimov, The Foundation, which was written in the 50s when Europe was at the foundation. Europe was developing from crisis to crisis, and by solving one crisis, it has always sown the seeds of the next crisis. The founding fathers knew that Europe will need to develop from crisis to crisis, but they also, founding fathers at different stages of the European development, were wise enough that they knew they cannot find, because of the political structure, they never can find an optimal solution. Because of the political consensus need, they will always find suboptimal solutions. But they have always written the contracts in a way that when that suboptimal solution have created the next crisis, the only way to get out of the crisis is to go for more integration. For example, the most typical and most easily understandable example of that was to create a monetary union without creating its logical counterpart, a banking union and a fiscal union. They could easily create the monetary union because it was politically popular and easy to sell. It was very difficult to create a fiscal union when there was no urgent pressure. Why is that difficult? And why is it a major change that is happening today? Think about what is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the heart of every politics. Fiscal policy is in each and every parliament is about how much money we take from one group in our society and how much money we give to other groups in our society. Redistribution is the most difficult political choice, and that is why fiscal policy decisions, the budget, is always the big vote of confidence in each and every year in a parliament. Now, what has happened now with the introduction of the European semester and the coordination in economic governance and economic policies, the related sanctions, what it is showing, what it means is that fiscal policy is going up to the Brussels level. Governments in Europe need to submit their next year budget plan in April each and every year, or March. and then they submit it to their own parliament in September. It's a huge loss of practical sovereignty. But that means that Europe, by solving its current problem of a lacking fiscal union, is immediately going into the next crisis, which is the crisis of democratic legitimacy. If the most difficult and most substantial decision of politics, if it's made in Brussels, then the voters in each and every country will ask how much impact they have on those decisions. Some of the voters in Europe are already facing this problem in their everyday life. The citizens of Greece have learned the old wisdom of Henry Ford, who in the 1920s have said, you can order the Ford T model in any color as long as it's black. This has practically happened to the citizens of Greece, who have changed their government 3 times in the last 12 months. But they always got the same economic policy. Because that economic policy was coming from the market necessities represented by Brussels, or in the tabloids represented by Germany. Now that limited sovereignty is obviously creating political crisis. And obviously it will need to generate a political answer in Europe to this problem of legitimacy. Now, what is happening, we can approach this process and understand this process from a different angle. The 2 most important actors in politics are markets and voters. And their constant wrangling is driving politics. And what has happened now, that both markets, and with a very little delay after them, voters have realized that if they want to find problems to their questions and solve their problems, increasingly they need to go to Brussels and not to the national capital. And that is what is causing these problems. And what you see is for the markets, extremely slow, for Europe, unexpectedly fast adjustment to the market needs, which is now obviously creating a strong response from voters, and Europe will need to adjust itself to the demand of voters very quickly. I have met another fund manager, again a year ago, who at a conference said events in this crisis can move from the impossible to the inevitable without ever stopping at probable. And that is clearly what has happened in terms of Europe. Who would have thought 3 or 4 years ago that this kind of European concentration of economic and fiscal power could happen? If you made a vote in the European Council chamber of 27 prime ministers, probably it would have been 27-0, that it will not happen in the next 20 years, what we have already finished. However, this may not be enough. We probably need more, like in the banking union measures. Now, very often the economist likes to quote every 2 and 3 months the famous statement from Jean-Claude Juncker, which is the motto of these years. We all know what we need to do. What we don't know is how to get re-elected if we do what we need to do. And that sort of political problem is driving European politics these years. If the answer is more integration, then Europe will need to create a European democracy, which sounds very nice again, but will be very difficult to do. There was an Italian parliamentarian in the second half of the 19th century, just after the Italian Union was created, who went to the parliament and said, we have created Italy, now we need to create Italians. That in a larger scale is true for Europe, and it will be extremely difficult to do. I don't believe that we can anytime talk about the United States of Europe in a way similar to the United States of America. Europe is famous for its national identities, strong roots, and I cannot see in 100 years' time or 200 years' time Europe losing its national identities. We need to find our own way to these democratic problems. But we need to find ways of stretching the current limits of European integration, because the only way forward from this crisis is more integration. And I would expect that the answer to the current different levels of development will be a two-speed or multi-speed Europe. And I can only hope that the second speed will not be reverse gear, because that's also a possibility for many member states. But in order to go further with solving the European problems, it's not enough to write about the technocratically possible economic solutions to the current crisis. If you read the UK press, The Economist or the Financial Times or others, very often you find that high-quality journalists and commentators do not understand that there are very obvious solutions to these problems. Why don't Europe leaders accept these realities and make the change? And unless you analyze the politics, the popular behavior in this, you cannot find an answer to this. So the question is, how can you find a politically viable and economically sound solution to these problems? Let me just give you a quick sort of how a political economy-wise correct solution could be found. It's a rough example. You need to ask politically 4 questions and give answers to them. Number 1, politically you need to answer who is at fault for this crisis, who is guilty. And the first thing to accept is that everybody is guilty. Germany and France were watering down the Maastricht criteria, Greece joining the European Union on false numbers, Brussels accepting those false numbers knowingly that they are false. So everybody was more or less guilty in this. If everybody is guilty, then the political consequence that everybody will pay for that guilt. Those who have money will pay in cash, and those who don't have money will pay in austerity. And that is what is happening today. That's the number 1 Q&A. The second one is, can you realistically expect the citizens of Germany to pay another blank check, to sign another blank check without an expiry date for other countries in Europe, as they have done so many times in the past 60 years? No. Germany has got what it wanted, what it could hope from Europe. It got German integration, it got economic hegemony in Europe. It's the most prosperous country, in a large country in the continent. So why would they do that? So if the answer is no more blank checks without an expiry date, then the citizens of Germany has to be offered a solution that such a problem cannot occur once again in the future. And that is what is happening in Europe with these new sanctions and common economic governance rules and European semester and six-pack and two-pack and all that stuff, giving assurance to Germany. And I could talk about all the net contributors, the Northern European center of Europe, that they are receiving all those assurances in exchange for what? They are ready to pay one last time the bill for Europe. The number 3 political economy question is, can you realistically expect the citizens of Greece, and to a lesser degree Portugal, Spain, Italy or others, to walk into a tunnel knowing there is no exit at the other end? Because this is what citizens of Greece are being asked at the moment to do. With the level of development in Greece, there is no chance that they could repay 130 or 40% of debt to GDP. So cutting back from 200 to 140 is no solution. There is this great book, This Time is Different. I'm sure some of you have read it. But there is a full chapter devoted to it by Kenneth Rogoff and his partner about the fact that the countries in the world, those countries who went bankrupt between 1970 and 2000, more than half of those countries went bankrupt below a 60% 100% debt to GDP level. And the conclusion is because the quality of institutions, government institutions, were so low that they couldn't manage that level. While higher quality institutions can manage above 100% levels, like in Japan or Italy. So the problem that Greece, where there is a serious problem of even collecting basic taxes, and the level of industrial development in Greece cannot justify 130–40% of debt to GDP. Therefore, it is inevitable that to conditionally, in exchange for reforms and continued austerity, to cut back those public debt that is given to Greece to a reasonable 60–80% level, where there is hope, where there is light at the end of the tunnel. And if such a 10-year conditional program is running through, then at least the citizens of Greece can hope that if they do what is necessary, they will get out of trouble. Without there is no political reason why they would accept what is happening in their country. So I personally see a further significant cut of official lenders' debt to Greece inevitable in the coming years, and this is just a matter of political timing when it will happen. And the fourth and most important question to ask is, would anybody be better off in Europe or any partner of Europe if the Eurozone collapses? Because we could talk for hours, I could talk for hours about why the Eurozone has troubles, why it's a bad construction, and why it was badly done at the beginning. Would anybody be better off if it breaks up? No. There was a calculation which was later on questioned by UBS last year, which said if Greece leaves the Eurozone, it would suffer a 40–45% hit on its GDP further. But if Germany leaves the Eurozone, it would suffer a 20–25% hit on its GDP as a consequence in the coming few years. Can you imagine those numbers? Even if half of those numbers are true, even if Germany would only suffer a 10% hit on its GDP, that is wartime number. So, and that is what many leading politicians in Europe have been late in explaining to their citizens, the actual consequences of the breakup of the Eurozone, until actually Angela Merkel was the first one who started to speak very openly about that 18 months ago, roughly. But still, it has to be explained. Now, there is a problem, however, that the founding fathers of Europe have designed the European Union as developing from crisis to crisis for more integration. But they forgot to put it in the small letters attachment, precaution, that there is no guarantee that every crisis will be survived. And so while the logic is there, the functionalist logic is there behind Europe, but and we clearly see what would be logical and rational, but our history books are full of momentary lapses of reason. That's what history books are about, actually. And the danger in Europe's very complex economic and political structure is that momentary lapses of reason may start from a very small country. An assassin in Serbia or things like that can cause the whole continent collapse for a century. Like it happened 100 years ago. It will be 100 years next year. So while every reason says that Europe and the Eurozone should survive and integrate further, finding its new special European model of democratic market economy, we have to be very careful of momentary lapses of reason. And so if I were a Eurozone investor, I would keep 80% of my money in euros because I believe it will survive, and 20% I would keep in probably US dollars in my pocket because still there is a major, not insignificant risk, although I'm a strong believer of European integration.
You wouldn't put it in foreigns?
I was a bit afraid of this question being asked. And because of BA delaying, I saw that you already were very deep into the Hungarian problem, which was not on my primary agenda, but I will answer any question if you want to ask that. Now, let me spend 8 more minutes on Central and Eastern Europe, and then leave room for questions. On Central and Eastern Europe. The countries, the newly joined members of Europe from Central and Eastern Europe are facing a very tough dilemma since they're joining. It is, what we want is converge as fast as we can to the European Union standards of living. On the other hand, we are accessing a region which is in itself in crisis. So we are getting closer and closer and trying to be more and more alike than a region which is in itself is in crisis. Typical problem of the latecomers. And our dilemma is how to get the best out of Europe without committing the same mistakes that has led them to problems. So, and the situation in Central and Eastern Europe is not so clear as we have believed 20 years ago. When I finished my studies at the recently converted Budapest University of Economics, Sir Ralph Dahrendorf, a German-born English scientist, came to Budapest and gave an interview and said, you can change the political regime in 6 months. You can change the economic system in 6 years, but you can only change society in 60 years. And we are in year 20 now, 1/3 of the world. And our great belief 20 years ago that it's going to be a linear process of convergence has not come true. Each and every country, if you look at the last 20 years history, has had their zigzags. Slovakia in the Mečiar years, Poland in the mid-2000s under the Kaczynski period, and sometimes before, going from crisis to crisis. The first 10 years, Hungary was the winner of the convergence story. But now Hungary is in my mind in a zag after a long zig, and I can only hope, and I'm working on it personally myself, that it's only a zag, and we are coming back to a more linear development and progress story. So, how these countries come to these zigzags is dependent on their political culture and their inheritance of socio-economic factors of indebtedness, social development, social state, welfare development, etc. But sooner or later, most of these countries have come to their development trap. The development trap coming from the fact that the country as a whole is accessing the developed part of Europe very fast, but the internal differences within a country are growing very fast. So the society is growing apart very quickly. This is known as the Kuznets-Williamson factor in development economics. And those countries who had a very high level of inactivity, like Hungary, or to a degree Poland, have been coming to this development trap sooner or later. And while these countries have shown a tremendous convergence between 1995 and 2008, in the aftermath of the crisis, these different ships are taking very different directions. Some countries are trying to join the center of Europe, the economic center of Europe, while other countries are risking to slip down to the problematic periphery of Europe with their economic and social development. And it is my conviction that those countries will be successful who can, from their own level of development, can mirror the successful strategies of those central countries in Europe who have escaped out of the globalization trap to the knowledge economy. And those who try to compete simply on cheap labor will suffer. So the right strategy is to try and catch the boat of the northern countries of Europe become a manufacturing and service belt of Europe with a proper unit labor cost, which is growing in line with productivity. Invest into education and higher education, high quality education in these countries, opposed to what is happening in my country today. Accumulate capital inside the country, foreign and domestic capital, and try to keep money in the country and not chase it out of the country. Increase capex to around 25% of GDP, at least. Reduce corruption and improve the level of governance and quality of governance through important public sector reforms. Focus on helping small and medium-sized enterprises to link to the European market, which is the world's largest and most valuable market today. And turn your economic, social model into a sustainable one, sustainable from the financial as well as the environmental point of view. And also these countries can only be successful in the European quid pro quo arrangement if they are able to team up. The Visegrad 4 is a very important formula which in certain periods of the last 20 years have been very successful, and sometimes it was forgotten. But it's a very clear interest group in Europe, and Europe is a place of interest representation which is built on alliances. And those who can build successful alliances inside Europe can get their wish through, they can get their interests be validated. We have been successful on energy security, sometimes on agriculture or climate change policies. We need to do it more. A new revival of the Visegrad 4 strategies has to be developed by these countries. So there are ways that this region can be successful. It will develop on the individual strategies and on the quality of governance in each and every country. Those countries which are lucky enough to have sustained good governance for 6 to 8 years can very quickly develop, because there is a huge growth potential embedded in these countries, but only in case good governance is present for a durable period. However, to close these remarks, I would like to tell you that in the crisis and managing a post-crisis environment, governments everywhere in Europe have at least 3 major tasks. One is to make sure that the crisis is as short as possible, that they do not burden the life of their citizens with unnecessary zigzags because of populist politics. So crisis should be as short as possible. Second, each and every government has the responsibility that in the worst of the crisis they have to keep the cohesiveness and solidarity in their society. Because if the social net, the social solidarity is falling apart, it takes decades to rebuild trust in the society. But the third and most important responsibility of each and every government is to make sure that all the suffering and difficulty that they ask from their citizens will at the end be worthwhile. That they are not asking sacrifice in vain. And that requires not populism, not pure technocracy. It requires good politics and good governance. That's what Europe and each and every nation state would require in the aftermath of this crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.